Thank you. We are the federal government. We do start on time. And it is so great to see you all. I'm so glad to be here in person with all of you. I want to kick this off, though, by introducing Anne Friedman. Anne Friedman created this place, Planet Word. She's the founder and CEO of Planet Word, and I think you can agree with me, this is a pretty extraordinary place to be. She was a teacher in the Montgomery County Public Schools. Here we are in a great public school building. Chairman of the board of the Seed Foundation, the parent body of the nation's only public inner-city college prep boarding school. She's a trustee of the American Alliance of Museums, whose advocacy event I spoke to yesterday, by the way, and has worked with the Aspen Institute's Ascend program and is a co-vice chair of the Aspen Music Festival. We are really honored to have Anne Friedman here to welcome us.
So welcome, everybody. It's so great to have you here. And when I saw there it said empowering readers, empowering citizens, I was like, wait, did they steal that from Planet Word? Because that is exactly why this museum exists. I was a reading teacher, the best job I ever had in my entire life, the most fun, most meaningful. But then I retired, and I didn't want to leave literacy behind, so I was looking for ways to continue in the field. And I read about a museum in New York that was bringing math to life with technology in a museum setting, and I thought, oh, there's the idea. And why was that so important to me? And what you're all here about is because I had heard a speech in 2004 given by the former head of the NEA, who said that they had done a survey showing that readers were voters. Readers were more likely to be active in their communities, to be volunteers, and to vote. So I felt like the only way we could ensure the strength of our democracy for the future would be to create citizens who were readers. And how could we do that when all the evidence was that reading was, declining, and people were finding too many other ways to entertain themselves? And so I felt like we've got to bring a buzz to reading. We have to make it cool. How could we do that? And seeing what they were doing with math in New York, I thought, okay, we can do that with words and language. And that's the origin story of Planet Word. And I hope that when you have time later this afternoon to go through our museum and see the experiences that we've created, that you'll think that we've done what I wanted to do and made reading really cool and fun, and something that everyone would want to try, and also not just reading, but words themselves. We want to make sure that people are aware of the words that they use, the words that are used around them. That builds empathy in our globalized community. And we need that more now than ever. So thank you, and enjoy your lunch and your meeting.
Thank you, Anne, so much. So the last time before the pandemic, last meeting before the pandemic that I went to, there was a celebration of the Community Librarian of the Year, Rivka Sass from Sacramento. Rivka's with us today. And the deputy mayor, yay! The deputy mayor of Sacramento was there. I think that's his title. And he said to us, he said, when we have a problem in Sacramento, we turn to Rivka and to the Sacramento Library. The first meeting post-pandemic I went to was to hand the National Medal for Library Service to Keenan McCloy in the Memphis Public Library, and I don't remember the exact title, but he was like the deputy mayor. Keenan came to that meeting, and he said, when we have a problem in Memphis, we turn to Keenan and the Memphis Public Library. And then I went about a week after that, I went to Highwood, Illinois, where we gave the National Medal to Carmen Patlan in the Highwood Library. They're a town of 5,000 people nestled in among the North Shore elite. That's 5,000 first and second generation immigrants that the library serves in so many ways. And the Congressman Schneider, United States Congressman, showed up, the mayor showed up, the state senator, the state representative, the city council showed up, 2/3 of the population showed up, and the dog catcher and the meter maid, and they all said, when we have a problem in Highwood, Illinois, we turn to Carmen and to the Highwood Public Library. So you are the Swiss Army knife of the communities of this country. So why did I cajole and inveigle and blackmail you all to come here? The first group of library minds pulled together, actually probably the most exciting and extraordinary group of library minds since the last conversation that Thomas Jefferson had with Benjamin Franklin. And it seems like that was right before the pandemic. The reason is we know how important we are to the community, but what's happened because of that? An awful lot of what we do in the library world is inertial response to whatever the community wants, to whatever is going on in the world. The digital revolution has taken us over. The pandemic took us over, for sure. The polarization of this country is at our front door. We're on the front lines of the culture war. The changes in our country, the demographic changes, the changes, the political changes in our country, the deep immigration. We have the highest level of immigrants in the United States since the 1920s, which was the highest level of immigrants ever in the history of this country. The focus on inequality and on equity, two actually, I think, different things, but two important things, and George Floyd. The racial reckoning in this country, which we have to go through, we must go through, and which libraries are engaged in. But how much purpose are we showing in this? I want to step back and think about the library as a place with a purpose. And I hope that that's the conversation we can have here. When I thought about this conference originally, there were three people that I wanted to invite. Robert Putnam and Shaylyn Romney-Garrett, his co-author of Upswing, and Bob I've known for a long time. I wanted to invite Marianne Wolf because she is the most inspirational person I know about reading, and I wanted to focus on reading. And Danielle Allen. And Danielle couldn't come, but Danielle's book, Our Declaration, which is about the Declaration of Independence, is, in my view, one of the great books of our time. She discusses how her belief that the Declaration of Independence addresses our problems today and can profoundly inform the dialogue that we need to have on all these issues. She decided, she agreed to come, but then she decided to run for governor of Massachusetts. Fortunately, Bob Putnam and Shaylyn Romney-Garrett, who's with us here today in person, agreed to come right off the bat. And you'll find that in Upswing, and I'm going to mention this again when I do the actual introduction of Bob and Shaylyn, that Danielle Allen is there prominently in the book on the last page, actually. But Bob is, of course, the most important delineator of the decline of community in the recent history of the United States, and he and Shaylyn, of course, address what we might be able to do about it in this latest book. I believe that one of the things that they say in this book And that is something that Danielle also, her work is about, and Marianne's work is about as well, is about what happens at the local level. It's a Tocquevillian view of the world of what happens when we associate. The great thing that Tocqueville said about America, the unique thing he said about America, was that we come together in our townships, it was the 1830s, in our townships and create associations around our problems. And they spring up spontaneously. And I believe that the power of the traditional library and our role in reading, and particularly in children's reading, is the Archimedean leverage point in what we do with our partners in the community. And I wanted the greatest evangelist of that, Marianne Wolf, to be here with us, and she will be virtually. And then I had this all set, and then I read Tim Coates's Freckle Report. Using IMLS statistics, Tim came to the conclusion that there must be correlations between the decline in spending on books and materials generally, particularly print books, the decline in circulation and visits to the library, and particularly the decline in children's circulation and children's visits, and perhaps a correlation with a decline or a failure to do anything about the problems of reading among the most challenged people in our community and the literacy of our communities. And what we know is true about reading is that it correlates with virtually every measure of success, and it correlates with virtually every division and divide that we have in this country. So I believe that is the right question. Tim's question is the right question. And so we've put together a panel to discuss that, and we'll see. There should be an interesting discussion about whether or not we're using our resources correctly and what the focus of our resources ought to be. To me, that is the ultimate question, the focus of our resources. But I had one more conversation that was important that we added on to what we're doing here. Tony Age called me. Some of you will know Tony. Many of you will know about Tony. He's the Chief Technical Officer at the New York Public Library, formerly doing the same things at the BBC and the Guardian in England. And we knew we didn't have enough people from Great Britain coming to this conference. It was our form of diversity. And so Tony, in his conversation, asked a group of us, some of whom, or I think all of whom are here today, asked us, what does a bookless library look like? He said, I'm creating a bookless library, and what does that look like? And he said this with a certain amount of shock and startling attention to the fact that he was creating something that he didn't particularly, I think, like. And so I think what the conversation over the next 2 days is all about, bringing these people together, bringing the great panelist groups that we have, and all of you, is, if anything, about the soul of the library. What is a library today? What will it be in the future? What are we doing for the community? Where is our leverage point in the community? Where is our importance in the community? And so I'll leave you with that thought. I don't know what will actually come out of this, whether it will be research, orientation of the IMLS, best practices, a call to action about reading, or simply a redoubling of what we do today so well in our communities. But I do know it's a conversation that we've got to have, and I'm really glad I'm having it with you. So I'll turn it over to Terry DeVoe to explain what we're doing.
Brene Brown's calling this the great awkward. You can see I'm navigating it already. I'm Terry DeVoe from IMLS, and I'm so happy you're all here. I normally have more of a backstage role at our agency, administering grants to the wonderful state library administrative agencies, some of whom are here today. But because we have a very packed agenda, I'm gonna go to show you that over the next 1.5 days, we're trying to fit in a lot, as Crosby has sort of outlined for us. My main role as the facilitator in this event is just to keep us moving. So I am aided by our fabulous organizers in the wings. They are all over, and we collectively are going to keep this moving on track. We are collectively the yin to Crosby's yang. He can expound on all the wonderful philosophical things, and we'll come back to the timing. We're the collective brain, or brawn, I should say, to his brains. But we are so happy you're here, and we welcome you to Washington, D.C. It's our deep desire throughout the next few days to ensure a safe space for everyone. In this venue, we have some requirements and some flexibility, so we're going to do our best to navigate both. Masks are required inside the common areas. These include the lobby downstairs, all of the hallways, and the restrooms. Masks are not required in this fourth floor venue that we are in together. So to navigate people's personal preferences in this fourth floor level, we're using stickers on our name badges. If you have a green sticker, we are signaling that you're open to handshakes or hugs. Yellow is more like a fist bump or an elbow bump, and red means you're really social distancing still. There are restrooms on all floors. This restroom on our floor is a single restroom, gender neutral. So if you want more options, you can head down the stairs or the elevator. On this side, it's a little easier to access the multi-unit restrooms, which are just a floor below us. And there are restrooms on all the other floors as well. All the food is packaged as single serve to also keep us safe. And we'll have snacks throughout the day and a lunch for you, a grab-and-go style lunch tomorrow. At your table, I guess I will stay on this slide for a moment, sorry. At your table, we have prepped readiness tents, which we encourage you to use to signal to your table mates. If you're feeling a little more introspective and you want to reflect on things a little bit longer, you can flip the side of the tent to your table mates that says reflective, I believe, or I'm feeling reflective. And if you're ready to just jump right in and have the discussion, then you can flip it around to the ready to discuss side. So we figured that would be a helpful signal as we move into our table activities. There are fidgety things if you need to keep your hands busy. I see lots of pipe cleaners. Feel free, they're for you. We've got sticky notes or little Post-it notes in there. We're going to be collecting questions on Post-it notes. That's one option. We're also going to have mics during the question and answer session if you would prefer to stand up and ask your question in person. There is an IMLS staff person at each of your tables. If you haven't met them already, you'll meet them shortly. And we also have host designations on our name badges, so if you have any questions, just seek one of us out and we'll be happy to help you. We have easels in a couple of places, one on the side and one in the back. These are our parking lots. So if topics come up that feel adjacent to the topics of conversation, a little off topic, but you still want IMLS to know that you have thoughts on your mind, we welcome you to use the parking lots. And if something comes up that seems like it needs more emphasis, you can use the parking lot for that too. We do have a kind of overriding question at the front of the room, which Crosby touched on, and that could be used for parking lot thoughts as well. We want to keep at the top of your mind the question of, as IMLS, what kind of grant making or policy, research, or other kind of work should we prioritize to advance literacy? So we're going to keep coming back to that theme and would welcome you to keep it at the top of your mind and use the parking lot for thoughts along that vein as well. All right, so we talked about physical safety, but we also want to foster a safe space in our dialogue together over the next day and a half. So to ensure that our discourse is productive, we would ask you to lead with courtesy and demonstrate respect for others. This convening's topic is really important, and we know a lot of you feel really impassioned about it, and we're welcoming your passion. We just ask that you continue to listen with an open mind throughout the remarks. create an environment where everyone can choose to speak deeply and freely about their experiences. We ask you to think before speaking. And more logistically, when the time comes for us to be in dialogue together, we do ask you to use the microphones if you're asking a question. We're both recording this, and the microphones enable us to pick up the conversation for perpetuity, and it helps each other in the room hear each other better. Please do your part to let everyone participate. Everyone here brings different experiences that are really important. You've all been hand-selected to be here, and we think of you as thought leaders. So we want everyone to get a chance to ask the questions that are important to them and say the thoughts that are on their mind during the table discussions. And that means that all of us need to be gracious and give each other the chance to speak. So we're depending on you to make this a good, safe dialogue space, not without passion, not without strong thoughts, but just respectful. Now we get a chance to try this out. We are going to have a 10-minute activity where you get to introduce yourselves to each other at your tables. So we're calling this Pass the Mic. We don't actually have mics for each of the tables, so, get a pipe cleaner or something. But we're gonna have you introduce yourself one at a time, passing the mic to the right, and you each get about 1 to 2 minutes to tell us the following. We wanna hear your name, role, organization, and title, so where are you from, what do you do, and then share the goals and activities of your organization and how they relate to literacy and social well-being. And then we'd like to know what you're hoping to take away from the convening. So with 10 minutes, pass the mic.
So now it is a real honor for me. We're going to present to you virtually Bob Putnam, the Malcolm Research Professor of Public Policy at Harvard, and then a member of the National Academy of Sciences, a fellow of the British Academy, Tim and Tony. And in 2012, President Obama awarded Bob the National Humanities Medal. And Shaylyn Romney-Garrett. And Shaylyn has worked with Bob on Upswing, co-author on Upswing, worked with him on the book American Grace, How Religion Divides and Unites, is a contributor to the Aspen Institute's initiative, Weave, the Social Fabric Project, has her own personal journey documented in her blog, Project Reconnect, her personal journey back to community, as she says, and co-founded with her husband, Think Unlimited, a venture in catalyzing social innovation in the Middle East. In my 15 years at the Kansas City Public Library, I invited Bob to speak 3 times. He represents to me, and certainly in his work with Shaylyn in Upswing, the latest book, the best thinking about social well-being in our community. In Bowling Alone, he chronicled the decline of community and civic life, from Rotary to Republicans and Democrats, and our social life, churches, family, and even friendship declining. In Better Together, he assimilated his critics' comments on Bowling Alone and wrote an ode to those new forms of community represented by things like megachurches and, importantly for us, libraries. In Our Kids, a book about, in many ways his most personal book, a book about Port Clinton, Ohio, where he grew up. He wrote about the decline of community there and the generational decline in mobility from his generation to the younger generations, in which he said, in upward socioeconomic mobility, the factors for, is it poised to plunge? The factors for which we have found growing class gaps are precisely the same factors that economist Raj Chetty and his colleagues have found to be associated with socioeconomic mobility across America today. Family stability, the decline of; residential segregation, the continuation of; school quality, take your pick; community cohesion; and income inequality. Now in Upswing, Bob and Shaylyn try to answer the question of what we can do, how America came together a century ago the progressive era, and can we do it again? And here they quote on the last page, Danielle Allen. Political philosophers have generated the view that equality and freedom are necessarily in tension with each other. We think we are required to choose between freedom and equality. Under the general influence of libertarianism, both parties have abandoned our declaration. They have scorned our patrimony. Such a choice is dangerous. If we abandon equality, we lose the single bond that makes us a community. As Alexis de Tocqueville, and so Bob and Shaylyn say, like Allen, we reject the view that more freedom necessarily entails equality and less equality in community, believing instead with Alexis de Tocqueville that individualism, rightly understood, is perfectly compatible with community and equality. I think Shaylyn Romney-Garrett and Bob Putnam are the right people to talk to us about what library means in a world in which freedom and equality have to be sought together. Shaylyn.
I think actually maybe I'm coming next, unless Shaylyn wants to take over here.
And wait for my turn. I can see you. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Okay,
sure.
great.
And well, let's go back just a second because I wanted to say something. Can we go back to the there? I wanted to say something to Crosby, who correctly reports that he and I have known each other for a very long time. And we've known each other for a very long time for many reasons, because we share values and so on. We both have Midwestern roots, but especially because we both value the importance of libraries. And in the first part of our remarks today, libraries won't seem to be an important part of the story. I'm going to be talking about a much larger picture in which, toward the second half of our remarks, though, when Shaylyn is talking, she's going to be talking about what happened when we faced similar problems to those today, but we faced them 125 years ago. And libraries, and especially Carnegie Public Libraries, are going to play a very important part of that story. So I ask you to bear with me now. Now we can go to the PowerPoints if you'd like. What I'd like to do now is summarize for you very, very quickly the first half or part of this book called The Upswing. How America came together a century ago and how we can do it again. And then you see this chart, and which is a little puzzling. What's the chart doing on the front page of a book? If we go to the next page, I'm going to try to explain to you why that chart is important. Here's the fact. America today, by many, many hard measures, has reached historic levels. First of all, of political polarization. We've hardly ever in our American history, maybe in the period between 1860 and 1865, but maybe not even then, have we reached the level of political polarization that we are now. And then independently of that, we have reached historic levels of economic inequality. Perhaps never in our history has the gap between rich and poor been greater. And then, seemingly independently of that, the level of social isolation and social fragmentation in America is extremely high, and probably it's a little harder to measure this, but probably we've never had the degree of social fragmentation and social isolation as we do today. And finally, and this is a little also hard to measure, but in this book we do try to measure this, the degree of cultural self-centeredness, the sense in which we're focused on ourselves, on each of us individually, on our own self-interest. That too has hardly ever been reached. So the first question of the book is, how did we get here? And I'm going to say a little bit about that. And then, of course, the much more important question is, how do we get out of here? In other words, how can we reverse these trends? And that's when Shaylyn is going to come in and provide at least the beginnings of an answer to that. So let's go to the first slide. If I'm a numbers person, and if you like numbers, you've come to the right place. I'm going to use a lot of numbers here, but if you don't like numbers, don't worry. I mean, part of it, some of us like numbers and some of us don't. If you happen to be a non-numbers person, that's okay. Settle back, close your eyes, and I'll try to tell you what's in these charts. So the horizontal axis of this chart, and of all the charts that I'm going to be talking about, is history, American history, running over from the left-hand side, 1880, 1890, the end of the 19th century, and zooming across the 20th century all the way up to the right. We find, if you run a little laser pointer over to the far bottom right, and then here we are, and this is now basically 2020, or right now we're down to 22. But basically, each of these charts horizontally is going to show change in America across this 125 years, from the end of the 19th century to the beginning of the 21st century. And the vertical axis is going to be some aspect of politics or economics or society or whatever. In this case, we're talking about political comedy or polarization. The way the chart is oriented, polarization is polarization is down and political getting along, bipartisanship is up. So let's see let me just talk through this chart first so you can see what I'm talking about. Over at the end of the 19th century, American politics was extremely polarized. Earlier it had been even more polarized in the Civil War period, of course, but then by the end of the 19th century, American politics was tribal. Basically, no cooperation across party lines. I'm going to skip here saying anything about exactly how we measured this, but I'm happy to talk about it, of course, because I'm a numbers guy. But behind each of these charts, including this one, there are half a dozen other charts that are specific measures of that variable. So here, for example, we're measuring, for example, the degree to which parties cooperate or don't cooperate across, politicians across party lines in Congress, or the degree to which ordinary citizens like or dislike people on the other side of the aisle. Many different measures, they all show the same story. And you can see here that what they show is at the beginning of the 20th century, America was very polarized. But then that began to change. And in the early years of the 20th century, began to become a little more cooperative, not perfectly cooperative, of course, but then that rises steadily, keeps going up during the 20s and 30s and into the 40s and into the 50s even. Now we're now into the 50s, and even in the middle of the 50s, and about in the middle of the 50s, we're amazingly unpolarized. That is, lots of political cooperation across party lines, symbolized by Dwight Eisenhower, who was president at the time, who was almost certainly the least partisan president in American history, except for George Washington. He could have run for the presidency in either party. I do not mean that Eisenhower caused that. I only mean that he reflected the degree to which people cooperated across party lines, and they didn't think basically about their own party. They thought about the national welfare. And that continued into the 60s. But then, as you can see, toward the end of the 60s and into the 70s, that begins to change. And then suddenly we begin to plummeting cooperation or increasing polarization. Down through the 80s and down through the 90s and down through the 2000s and down through the 2010s. And until now, and if we put on the graph the numbers up to now, it would be even lower. We're amazingly polarized. We're back even worse than we were 125 years ago. Now, let me pause just for a second. Some people think that in terms of American polarization, politics today, that a lot of this was the consequence of ex-President Trump. But as you can see, Trump can't be the cause of this. He comes in way too late. He doesn't enter American politics until this trend had been going down for 3 or 4 decades. So this story is the wide-angle view of how American politics have changed over the last 125 years. Now, I'm going to be a little more quick as we go through the other dimensions of change. Let's have the next slide, please. The next slide here, same horizontal axis from the 1890s over to today. This graph this is a measure of the gap between rich and poor, and the graph actually begins in the 1910s because that's the period when we begin to have really hard evidence. That's when the IRS is created. We begin to have really good evidence on the distribution of income and of wealth in America. And you can see when the curtain rises, America is very, very unequal, and that continues for the first 10 years of the measure, and then except that it is rising a little bit. There's a pause during the 1920s. That's the Gilded Age. That's when, once again, inequality is rising as you go from the 1920 to the late 20s. That's the Gilded Age, and you can see it in the numbers. But then, coming out of the Gilded Age, years before the New Deal, you can see that in the 30s, America was becoming steadily more equal. By that, I mean the gap between rich and poor was rising, and that's true whether we measured it in terms of income or in terms of wealth, whether we talk about the degree to which you could rise from the bottom of society to the top rungs of the economy. Every year, as you can see, through the 30s and through the 40s and through the 50s, steadily more equal. And that keeps rising. And rising even during the 50s and hits the peak just about the 1960s. Looks a little similar to that other graph. And then suddenly, surprisingly, that begins to change. Let me pause up at the top there. At the top there in the 1960s, we were very equal. America was a more egalitarian society in terms of the distribution of income than Sweden or Denmark, all those Nordic social democracies. We were even more equal than they are. But that ended in the late 60s. You can see we begin to become suddenly less equal. The gap between rich and poor grows steadily through the 70s and especially in the 80s and 90s down through the 2000s. You can see over there at the right-hand side for a second in the period around 2010, it looked like maybe that was ending, but no. If you kept on the graph with Trump and the epidemic and so on, now down in eggs, way down, way even further down. We are now way over there in terms of economic equality. So that's another chart. It's actually a little similar to the previous chart. It shows how our economy began by being unequal, and then there was this half-century long rise to the equality of the middle of the 20th century, and then suddenly this collapse back down, even worse than we were before. Let's have the next slide. Now the next slide is looking at social cohesion, or what I sometimes call social capital. That's the degree to which we're connected with our family and our friends and our neighbors and our community institutions. And again, you can see down at the end of the 1890s, Shaylyn will have a chance to say a little bit more about what that looked like, but at the end of the 19th century, Americans were very disconnected. They didn't, because they just moved from rural small towns where they knew everybody into the big anonymous cities, and people didn't know their friends and neighbors, and they separated from their families and so on. And so we were very disconnected from one another, low social capital. But then again, as you can see, as we entered the 20th century, there around 1900, suddenly that begins to improve, and the degree of social connection with, as I say, with family and friends and neighbors and so on begins to rise, steadily rises through the teens, and in the 1920s, again, there's that little bit of pause in the 1920s, but then coming out of the 20s, probably the greatest, and into the 30s and 40s, probably the greatest civic boom in American history. We were having kids, we were getting married at record levels, we were having kids at record levels. That's the baby boom period. We were joining clubs, we were getting to know our neighbors steadily through the 50s and 60s and into the 60s. And then suddenly up there at the top in the middle of the 1960s, suddenly, silently, mysteriously, people stopped going to clubs, they stopped joining bowling leagues, they stopped getting married quite so frequently, they didn't know their neighbors as well. And then, as you can see there, once again, into the 70s and into the 80s, it just goes down, down, down. More and more social isolation, less and less connection with our friends and neighbors. And again, it stops there. The data stopped there in the middle of the roughly 2015 is where the data go to, but it just keeps falling down, 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 further and further. Now, if you go back up the curve just to 2000, to point to the curve, that's where the book Bowling Alone was published. And at that point, I was describing the previous 2 or 3 decades of that downturn. Bowling Alone was basically a story only about this chart and only about those 3 decades from the 1970s or 3 or 4 decades to about 2000. But remarkably, as you can see, I wrote the book and then it just continued straight down. That is real prediction of the social sciences. It kept getting worse and worse and worse. And now, as I say, we're back down to the level that we were at the end of the 19th century. Let's go quickly to the next slide. This is next slide is about what we call cultural solidarity here. I really wish I had more time to talk to you about how we measure this, because I'm really proud. Culture seems like a pretty squishy idea, but we've got some really hard measures about the degree to which Americans have thought of themselves as either being each of us in it only for ourselves, or we're all in this together. And it turns out you can actually measure the degree to which Americans as a whole thought of ourselves as either each of us out for what was in it for me, or conversely thought of ourselves as being basically in the same boat, all in this together, and we rise or fall together. At the end of the 19th century, and Shaylyn will surely say more about this, at the end of the 19th century, Americans were unbelievably focused. I think we could call it I-focused, very much focused on self-interest. But thinking it was a good thing. We should be just focused on number one. But then, as you see, once again, beginning in the early years of the 20th century, that begins to change, and we begin to be a little less focused on I and a little more focused on we, steadily upward during the 1910s. Again, there's that pause during the 1920s, but then again, beginning in 1930, roughly, again, steadily upward, more and more focus on what we have in common and what we owe to one another, steadily upwards until basically the same middle 60s. And middle 60s is when we were basically, compared to ourselves in the past, or even compared to other countries, we had a very kind of communitarian sense that we were all in this together and that we should look out for one another. But then again, at almost that same date, that begins to change. And we begin to focus more on our self-interests, I would say our selfish interests, down, 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 down. And once again, this graph happens to end about, 5 or 6 years ago, but if we kept on with the graph, it keeps going down further. Americans are maybe not quite as focused on self-interest as we were 125 years ago, but nearly so. Now, I want to put all those charts together, and let's see what they look like. Here we've just put all those same charts on the same graph. You can see economics and politics and society and culture. And this graph passes what statisticians call the interocular trauma test. It hits you between the eyes that there's something similar here, something going on here. It's not 4 separate stories, it's one story. As America moved at the end of the 19th century from very much an I focus, economic inequality, political polarization, social isolation, and cultural narcissism, toward a we society in the middle of the 20th century, in the 1960s roughly, we were focused, we were relatively equal, we were politically cooperative, we were socially connected, and we were culturally focused on we. And then almost symmetrically and almost simultaneously, all of those charts go down. That's not, and what it is what we're saying is those are not 4 separate charts. That's a fundamental history of how America changed over the course of from the end of the 19th to the beginning of the 21st century. And if you go quickly to the next chart, we put all these together, that's the trend. That basically is the core empirical study of our book, The Upswing. You can see there, beginning in the first half of this period, things are getting better and better. Almost every year, things are getting better, more equal, more cooperative, more connected, more focused on what we have in common. And then almost simultaneously in the second half of this period, we move in the other direction. Now, Shaylyn is going to take over here and tell you a little bit more about what may lie behind that graph, but especially she's going to focus on, because we're focused here not just on describing history, but we want to draw some lessons from history to say, how do we get out of this pickle that we're in now? And Shaylyn's going to explain that. Shaylyn, over to you.
Bob and I feel like we make a pretty good team here because he's the numbers guy. He's, of course, the world-class data scientist, and I'm the storyteller. He's also a fantastic storyteller, and he's taught me pretty much everything I know about that. So if you've gone to sleep with regard to the numbers, now is your chance to wake up and join me in the land of the non-numbers people. And I want to pick up the story here by going back to the question that Bob started with, which is how did we get here, right? That was the motivating question behind this research. We all recognize from our day-to-day experience that we are in the midst of a multifaceted crisis as a nation. That's not something that we need numbers to tell us. But how did we get here? And ours is not the first study that attempts to answer that question. There have been so many books, actually, in the past decade attempting to answer that question that one of the reviewers of our book said this is just the latest edition in the how America got into this mess genre of literature, right? But we tend to think that our study is a little bit different in that most of these books are looking at one of these phenomena, just polarization, or it's all about inequality. And we're looking at the fact that all of these are part of the same thing, the same trend. That's one difference. The other difference is that we tend to zoom our lens out a lot further. There's been a lot of books written about the decline over the last half century or more in one or many of these different phenomena, but less clear is the story of what happened before that. So if there's been a decline since mid-century America, what happened before the decline? And as we can see so clearly in what Bob has discovered through this data-based story, is that there was actually an upswing that preceded the downturn. So when you ask yourself, what's the lesson from all of this data, and each of the graphs that we showed you represents scores of underlying measures. So we're talking about, all kinds of different measures, so disparate that it's kind of hard to believe that they all follow the same trend. We're talking about things like how often Congresspeople, vote for legislation introduced by the other party, as well as, what people have named their children, whether they've chosen more common names or more uncommon names over the course. All of these data points, very, very different measures are combined here and are illustrating the same trend. Now, there's one way that you could look at this story, which is that we need to just turn back the clock to this supposed golden age in American history when everything was better. We can see it right here in the chart, right? And we've seen that rhetoric a lot, particularly in the last several years, right? That we need to make America great again. Now, we want to emphasize that this is not the story that we want to tell from this data. The story here to us, what's less relevant to us is looking at the period in history when these trends supposedly culminated, when we were at some sort of peak. That's actually less interesting than the realization that this multifaceted crisis that we are in right now, we have been here before. By hard measures across scores of different phenomena, we have been in the exact same place that we are in today once before. And just like today, the social commentators from the first Gilded Age during the 1890s, 1900s were decrying the end of democracy. The American experiment has failed. Plutocracy, tyranny, all is lost. Does that sound familiar? But what the story of the upswing tells us is that none of those doomsday prophecies were realized. It didn't happen. On the contrary, we entered a multifaceted, multi-decade upswing in which year upon year, the ship righted itself. So the question of our study is, what can we learn from the upswing, the moment that looked most like the moment we're living through, that gave way to a period of things getting better and better? What can we learn from that moment in terms of how we could bring about another upswing today? So I want to highlight just a few lessons from this period when the upswing, when the Gilded Age gave way to the Progressive Era. which is when this upswing really picked up steam. Now, before I do that, I want to just pause and clarify that when we're using the term progressive in this presentation, we're using what we call capital P progressive, meaning the historical period or the movement that took place during the early 1900s. And historians have called the progressive movement of that time so diverse as to be barely coherent. It was a bipartisan movement that included all different types of people, different genders, different classes, and it was not what we would call progressivism today. The term that as we hear it used today is what we would call small p progressivism, which describes the leftmost side of the political spectrum. Okay, so when we're talking about progressivism, we're talking about this historical movement that was incredibly diverse, but that was animated and united by this galvanizing belief in the power of everyday citizens to make change. That's the progressivism that we're talking about. So if we go to the next slide, let's look at a few of these lessons from America's last upswing, this moment when the progressive era began to change the course of American history. So as Bob noted, we're looking at all of these, this is a data-based story, so we're looking at all these different measures. And when you have trends over time that start to all move in the same direction at roughly the same moment, you might say to yourself, well, if we could figure out what the leading variable is, in other words, which of those trends started moving in the right direction first, if we could figure that out, then maybe we would know what was driving or leading the rest of the variables to go upward, right? So the question is, statistically, can we identify that? Well, the first thing that we can identify is actually the lagging variable, the thing that happened last, which surprisingly turns out to be economics. We kind of have this bias in American culture that economics drives everything. And I think that comes mostly out of the social sciences, where people are often treated as economic animals. We tend to think if we could just fix the economic inequality first, then we'll start to feel like we're all in this together and those other trends will begin to change. Well, we're not saying that fixing economic inequality is not important. It's absolutely critical. But what we do learn from the last upswing is that it is not the thing that changed first. It's the thing that changed last. So what do we learn from that? There may be underlying things that we need to get moving in the right direction first before we'll have the political will to change our economics. That's potentially one lesson we can learn here. So if we know that economic equality was the lagging variable, what was the leading variable? It seems clear from both the data and the historical record that it was a cultural and moral shift that actually began to change first. Bob spoke briefly about this, but the Gilded Age, again, end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, was characterized by a highly narcissistic, self-focused culture. And a big part of that was something called social Darwinism. So not too long before this, Darwin had articulated his theory of the survival of the fittest, which of course was meant to describe the natural world and how it worked. But there were social commentators that came along and said, well, if that's how the biological world works, that's how the social world should work. And that's a great way to organize society. And Darwin himself was not, there's some evidence that he was not very excited about this idea, just to sort of clear his name a bit. But there were people who really took this to heart and said, society is not about cooperation, it's about competition. And only the strong will survive, and the devil take the hindmost. That was really the reigning cultural ethos of the day. And into that, and that's what produced the robber barons, right? And the huddled masses on the Lower East Side and equivalent places all over the United States. Into that moment came moral voices that began to question that as an organizing principle of our society. And this, interestingly, moral movement came first and foremost out of evangelical Protestantism. It was Christians who began to say, first to themselves, I don't think we're actually living our own moral values. And there was a movement called the social gospel that began to say, now wait a minute. At the time, Christianity and the theology of Christianity was very much focused on me and my personal relationship with God and my personal sins and whether I was going to get into heaven. And everybody else's business, not my business. The social gospelers came along and said, wait a minute, we can't just apply our morality to our own life. We have to apply it to society and think about social sins and how we can begin to change those. That first took root in Christianity, and then it took root more broadly until we had a sort of moral outcry happening through the muckrakers and all of these people trying to bring to light what was really happening and call for change. And so this was the first trend that began to move upward, that began to change the way we thought about whether we were all in competition or whether we were all in this together. So that's a really important lesson, we think, from this period. So who were these progressive reformers who were having these moral moments? They were largely young. They were very young. The Jane Addamses, who started the Settlement House movement, and the Paul Harrises, who started the Rotary Club, and the Ida B. Wells, who was out there, showing forth to the nation the evils of lynching. They were all under the age of 30 when they were doing their most important work. These were young people who were living in a world completely different from the world that their parents had lived in. The Industrial Revolution had changed everything. And the old rules and the old institutions and the old social structures just didn't apply. And so these young reformers were energized with a totally new, innovative lens on what we would have to build to move the nation forward. And we believe that today, any upswing that we will see has to be led, architected, orchestrated by young people, just as it was last time. Young people who are not afraid to use a moral framework to call for change. And we're inspired by the fact that we are already seeing this. We're seeing it in the climate change movement. We're seeing it in the Black Lives Matter movement. We're seeing it in the calls for gun control. Young people who want change and who are framing it as a moral issue. So we think that there's cause for hope there, as well as cause for hope in youth voter participation numbers, which have never been higher except in this exact same era that we're describing, the last upswing. Another lesson from this period is that these young reformers, these young progressives, they were all about association building, and association as both an end and a means. So what does that mean? Well, if you look at the story of Paul Harris, he came from a small town in Vermont, moved to Chicago. He was part of that huge demographic shift during the Industrial Revolution. He became a lawyer, and he was very lonely. He just didn't know anybody in that town. So he decided to get 3 business people together to start something that was sort of like a lunch club. And it became the Rotary Club, which of course has, multiple millions of members worldwide. But it was really just first and foremost about meeting his need, his loneliness, a new way to bring people together. But progressives were also geniuses at bringing people together across lines of difference. The Social Settlement House movement is my favorite of those movements that was really intended to bring people who never had any contact with one another into contact with one another. And we, of course, know that libraries are another of the inventions of this period that do exactly that. So association was first and foremost about meeting that social isolation that we saw in the graphs, but then it became a means for creating change over time. The other thing to know about this period was that there was no real charismatic leader out there saying, I'm going to lead a progressive movement. Here's a giant national blueprint for how we're going to change everything. The progressive era is often framed this way in sort of cartoon histories, that it was all about these big national programs. But actually those big programs, the consumer protection agencies and the national income tax and all those things, were sort of the caboose of this movement. The engine was grassroots organizing, was people working in communities right outside their doorstep, in tenements, in neighborhoods, in municipalities, tinkering with solutions in what the progressive Louis Brandeis called laboratories of democracy, coming up with new models for how to solve problems that then went viral and became things that became adopted in other states and other places, and then some of which became models for national programs that changed the face of the nation. So there was nobody laying out a grand plan that then went from the top down. It started as a bottom up and was met from the top down with national programming. We believe that that is what another upswing is going to have to look like today. So the work that you are all doing out there on the front lines of your communities is the absolute most vital work of a new upswing. So those are some of the positive lessons of this period. I just want to end with sharing with you that there aren't all positive lessons from this period of the upswing, right? There are several cautionary tales as well. And I don't have time to share all of them with you, and I have only a little time to touch on this briefly. I wish there was more time to go in depth, but I will just say this. One of the biggest cautionary tales of the progressive era is simply that this we, the progressives, were building toward was not inclusive. It was largely a racialized we. And not to put too fine a point on it, but most of the progressives, not all of them, but most of them were racist. So a lot of the programs that they built that actually fueled this upswing, that got us closer to we than we'd ever been before, had knit into them the seeds of their own demise because they failed to take into account the need for full inclusion. As we've seen so many times in American history, the progressives too largely kicked the work of racial reconciliation down the road. And the needs of people of color, and to a certain extent women, were sort of sacrificed on the altar of progress. So any upswing that we would hope to create again today can't kick that problem down the road anymore. And I think one of the things that we can learn putting all of these lessons together is that the beginning of an upswing today is going to be about a cultural and a moral shift. And the place that has to start is with inclusion. It's not just about programs and policies and economic equality. It's about doing the heart work of racial reconciliation to create a new North Star for what a real inclusive we could look like. If we could do that and mobilize at the grassroots and get our young people involved and put association across lines of difference at the forefront of what we're doing, we believe that we can see another upswing, one that hopefully will be durable and will lead us closer to that ideal, beloved community that we know is possible. These are just a few of the lessons from this period. There's so much more we could say. I wish we had more time, but I will just leave you with one parting thought if we can go to the next slide. Teddy Roosevelt, who became one of the most articulate leaders of the progressive movement, said this: "The fundamental rule of our national life, the rule which underlies all others, is that on the whole and in the long run, we shall go up or down together." We believe that what these graphs and charts and statistics show is that when we lean into we, things get better and better. And when we lean into I, things get worse and worse. In the words of one of my colleagues who I love to quote, Eric Liu, he says, "We all do better when we all do better." That's what the data shows us. That's the story that we want to tell today. We believe that we've been in a mess just as ugly and gnarly as the one we're in today, but we got out of it once before. We made a lot of mistakes that we don't have to make again today, but we believe that we can do it again. And that's the hopeful message that we want to share with you today. And we're, of course, humbled and inspired by the fact that you're already doing it. So we're really grateful to be here and share this message with civic innovators such as yourself who are making this happen all across America today. Thank you so much.
So thank you so much, Shaylyn. Thank you, Bob. And now we'd like to get three panelists up here to talk about what we've just heard from Shaylyn and Bob. And I think they are all three people who are putting the we in the upswing. In fact, I think we should call them upswingers. So Dianne Connery, if you would come up. Dianne is the Pottsboro librarian, Pottsboro, Texas. The Pottsboro Library has been getting known, and Dianne has been getting known over the last few years as one of the great libraries in the country in rural Texas, voted one of the top 3 best small libraries in America in 2017. And Dianne herself was honored as an innovator in library journals, mover and shakers class of 2021. And those of us who've been on many calls that we've all, Zoom calls that we've all had about what we're doing in the library world, know that Dianne is doing so much in the way of outreach, digital outreach, and every kind of outreach in her community. I've already mentioned Carmen Patlan. Carmen, please come up. the Highwoods Public Library in Highwood, Illinois, getting our national medal. The truth about Carmen is that she's won it twice. She did it before in Waukegan as well. She was partly responsible or significantly responsible for that. The IMLS has given her two gold medals and two national medals, and I'm sorry, that's it for this decade, Carmen. And her outreach efforts are extraordinary across a wide variety of literacy, GED, English skills, ESL programs, et cetera. And she's done work with the House of Peace, a culturally informed shelter for women and children struggling with domestic violence. She's an extraordinary librarian. And our last icon of library world for this panel is Felton Thomas. I think everybody in the library world knows Felton, the Cleveland Public Library director, formerly the White House champion for change in 2016, president of the Public Library Association of America, a leader in technology, education, economic development, every aspect. So take it away, panelists.
All right. Well, I'll start. I want to read something to you really quickly. Social well-being. What is social well-being? Social well-being is having a sense of belonging to a community and contributing to society. It involves building healthy, nurturing, and supportive relationships, as well as fostering a genuine connection to those around you. So that is what Highwoods Public Library has done. We have nurtured a community that has been neglected. It's a small town of 5,400 people, and 50% are immigrants, mostly undocumented immigrants, who live in fear, who live hidden, who live invisible. And so the library is working very hard to make them present, because they are the economic engine, they're the underbelly of that community. And so why not provide them the resources, the literacy, the access to support that they need? So our library is focused on early childhood, young adult, and adult literacy. We've created programs specifically based on the needs of the public. The public informs our programming. And so I'll give you a very quick story about Betty. Betty came in to our library. Well, she didn't want to come into our library because she didn't trust our library. But I met with her and I encouraged her, and she felt welcomed. Betty came in, and all she ever wanted was to get her GED and to continue her education. So an immigrant, an undocumented immigrant, now has a GED and is now on her way to getting her business degree at the local college. Betty is now changing generational cycles of poverty, because her son will no longer be invisible, and her son is excited to go to college. And so this is what the library is doing in Highwood. It is transformational, it is impactful. We have programs, like I said, for youth, young adults, and we recently received a major grant of $578,000 to work on health equity, and so getting health access to individuals. So I think we're doing a pretty decent job of creating upswings. Hi, Dianne Connery. I am here, I think, as a spokesman for rural public libraries. Pottsboro is about an hour and a half north of Dallas, a town of 2,500 people, and I often say it's like driving back in time, and not in a good way. It's not a quaint little town. I have an advantage that maybe many of you do not, and that is we have almost no budget. 10 years ago, it was an all-donation, all-volunteer library, and the first meeting I went to was a discussion of how many months left before we closed. And long story short, a group of us decided, what if we just did everything differently and made this library so important to the community that then if we were going to close, people would be up in arms.
And so through grant writing, thank you IMLS and TSLAC, and many other foundations, we've had a lot of success with innovation, and that's energizing to me. We have been in the position, and the reason I said that I have an advantage that you don't, is there's very little bureaucracy over a small town library. If I get an idea in the morning, I can do it that afternoon. I don't have to go to a bunch of board meetings. And I think I have come to library world in such a fortunate time. Because of COVID, it was recognized what the lack of digital inclusion meant for rural residents. And so when we talk about kind of that social movement that then leads economic movement, there's money coming for infrastructure for rural libraries. I was fortunate enough, thanks to IMLS, to attend the National Digital Inclusion Alliance 2 weeks ago in Portland. And that's where librarians need to be, with these cross-sector coalitions of people talking about how are we going to make real impact. Because if libraries are about information, how much of it occurs now online? And so our library focuses on digital inclusion. We started with things like an esports team. I think we were the first public library in the nation to have an esports team, because so many people in our area don't have internet in their homes, and they don't have computers in their homes. And I saw these kids and like, how will they ever be on a level playing field with their peers from bigger communities if they don't know how to use a computer? And the pandemic started and we couldn't close because we're so essential to the community. People didn't have internet at home, so they came to us and they started asking us if they could connect with their doctors. And through a National Library of Medicine grant, we launched a telehealth room. And then that led to connections with National Library of Medicine and health system science researchers and clinicians and health literacy specialists. And it evolved in so many ways. And ECF funding, there's so much money on the table for libraries. And in my sphere that I'm aware of, so few libraries who were asking for that money. So our all-in Pottsboro taxpayer-funded operations budget, all in $39,000 a year. That's our total budget. We have requested, fingers crossed, $7.5 million in ECF funding to put up infrastructure throughout our county around libraries so that people can have internet in their homes. People who live within a mile of the library come to our library, check out a router, take it home, and have internet in their homes. Hotspots aren't a long-term answer. So at NDIA, they were talking about, hey, government has $42.5 billion to spend on digital inclusion, and they're not quite sure yet how to spend it. Librarians need to be at that table. And when Shaylyn talks about grassroots efforts, I think, and again, I'm biased, rural library, I think these are happening. Amazing things around the country are happening in rural libraries, but our capacity is limited because we're cleaning the bathroom and I'm spraying weed killer in the edible landscaping and, you know, all that kind of stuff. And so we don't have the time or don't make the time to advocate for the difference we're making in our communities. And that's something that I want to see come out of this, is for librarians to kind of have a louder voice, amplify their voice in the difference they make in their communities, so that these grassroots efforts can multiply and be bigger than themselves. Because I can't tell you how often I think I've had an original idea, I try to Google it, find nothing. 2 years later, I find, oh, some other library was doing that 2 years ago. I just had no idea. And I'll close up with saying one of my couple observations. I said I was close, and then I said a couple. Couple observations from the pandemic is all these, the federal government and all these organizations and nonprofits need libraries to make these programs and services real. They've got the theory, they've got the money, but how do they get to the people? And by libraries speaking up, we can be at that table, and we need to be at that table. So that's been one of my takeaways, is the importance of coalitions, these cross-sector coalitions, getting out of library world. And in our case, I think we've had to fight against the stereotype of what a library is and what we provide. So that's an uphill battle, but we're making progress on that. And so I think we are needed, and we just need to amplify our voices more. And then the final piece of that is researchers. I am not a numbers person, but I have now seen, and I have learned from some of the numbers people, that when we went into our program planning, we could talk with some of the researchers to find out, like, what would be a good assessment of this program? What are we trying to accomplish? Because I will admit, cover your ears, James, that when I'm as a small library writing a grant, I want to get something out there and I want to get the money, and then I need to implement it quickly. But if we could think bigger and get everybody working together, the researchers want us, we want them, how do we get together? And so I really feel like coalitions working on this are the way to make some progress.
Thank you. I want to thank Crosby for this opportunity to actually say Bob. Hey, Bob, you know, I mean, to the professor, be on the same kind of talking space with Bob and Shaylyn, who I have great, deep respect for, and I've been reading their work for a while. And I've been thinking a lot about a couple of concepts that are brought up in his earlier work around bonding and bridging. And the idea of bonding is that we typically kind of hang out with the people who are very much like us, same age, same religion, you know. And we, though to be successful, need to do more bridging, be around people who are different from us, different ages, different religions, different ethnicities. And so I wanted to share a story of that I think shows that really the leadership is going to come from the youth. And it was a very interesting program that kind of led me to this kind of thought that I wanted to share with everybody. So a few years back, the Jewish Federation, who's a partner of the library, came to us and said, right, we've heard about the partner city with Cleveland, which is Beit Shan, Israel, that they have this great library, and we would like you to go to Israel. And my answer was, okay, I'm packed, let's go, right? Right? And so went to see the library, and all of a sudden I started walking around, and there was nothing but like 12-year-olds and 13-year-olds and 14-year-olds. They were working behind the desk, they were doing circulation, they were doing all of these other things throughout the library. And I was like, and they said, this is it. The kids run the library, right? I was like, okay, right? And they said, well, let's go meet the librarian. And so the librarian was in the back room with his feet up. And I was like, this is genius, right? Get the kids to run the whole library. You just sit up and eat snacks, right? And he goes, no, this is my thought, right? We always tell the kids what to do. And Israel has a long history of letting young people lead. So I just let them run everything. And literally, he let them run everything. Every decision in the library was run by the young people, right? And so I was just kind of like, really surprised, and I spent some time with the kids, and I started to see the leadership development that was coming from this. They asked me to speak to the kids, and there was an 11-year-old doing my microphones and all the technology, right? And I was like, no disrespect, not to say that, right? Only 11-year-olds could do that, but it was so interesting seeing that, and so I wanted to come back to Cleveland and kind of put forward this option. Let's let the kids kind of run like the library, of which my leadership team said, that's the stupidest thing you've ever said, right? But what became very, very clear was that we have a kind of history of always telling young people what they're going to do, how they're going to do it. And as we started to kind of do a similar type of program, it was that same thing that continued to happen. Our older folks couldn't allow the young people to be free and allow them to make decisions. We always had to make sure and tell them this is not going to work, right? So they never had a chance to lead. So the Jewish Federation brought some of the kids from Israel to Cleveland to meet our young people, to kind of like push them to kind of move forward. And it was so interesting, right? Initially, these kids are from 2 different countries, but they were kids who were in Beit Shan. They were poor kids who were there, and they were with some of the poorest kids in Cleveland, right? And they started talking, and they started bonding, and soon they were starting to create a bridge between the 2 cities, right? And what came out of this was after the kids started like stopping wanting to do anything because they all wanted to go to the mall, they all wanted to hang out, and they became really close friends. So now continually they send messages to each other ahead of time because they're on different time zones, right? And they talk about how they're moving forward with their work. And the volunteers that now they are called instead of volunteers, they're now the volunteers who run a volunteer program out of our library for their community, right? Have just seen unbelievable growth in those kids, right? They are now leaders, all right? And they're getting up doing speeches in front of their peers, telling them how like they don't need to listen to adults anymore because they know how to do everything. Right? And it's a small scale thing to see these 2 countries bridged by these young teens from the poorest communities in their countries. But what it said to me and what I took from this was that there is a way for us to move forward if we get out of our way, right? That the adults aren't willing, and if this is going to happen, right? If we are going to see ourselves somehow take that bridge space and the leadership is going to come from these young people, somehow the older folks are going to have to find a way to get out of the way. So I am going to ask you 2 a question, right? Because we're short on time, right? And I wanted to make sure that this was one of those kind of questions, and Crosby has pushed me to put this out there, is while I agree that there are a lot of rural librarians doing great work and there are a lot of folks doing great work, I think sometimes we take this room and say that there are we could fill this room 10, 20 times over. But many times I see the same people in this room, right? Right? We're like the Illuminati. We're always here, right? And I think what we have to ask is, in this profession, do we need to do more to make sure that we could fill this room with 10 of us 10 times over, rather than the same folks that we see who are doing very progressive work?
I just wanted to add that what I've heard here is commonalities. I have a very small budget. I would consider myself a rural library. I'm an island in a community of extreme wealth. The North Shore is one of the wealthiest parts of Illinois, of the country for that matter. And so Highwood, my operating budget is $297,000 a year. But my real budget now is $1.5 million. And it is because of grants and it is because of grassroots efforts that we have been doing, and it is because all of our programming is run by informed community engagement. So we are out there, we are boots on the ground. The reason why I was able to receive 2 IMLSs is for a community engagement strategy that we have developed, that we connect with leaders from within our own community, empower them to go out and be our boots, eyes and ears on the ground. During COVID, that's what allowed the library to be a lifeline for our community. We never closed. We closed the front door, but we left the back door open. We served 23,000 meals during COVID. We partnered with Department of Public Health to do COVID testing. And so far, we partnered with Walgreens to do over 3,000 vaccines in the arms of community members. So we're a trusted source in the community. We are a bridge to connect individuals. We have a TAB team, which is a teen advisory board that is doing all of the teen programming. So we have commonalities. We don't let bureaucracy get in our way. We were on the verge of being shut down. It was because of Elizabeth Martin that's sitting over there, who wrote a strategic plan that made sense, that they hired a non-librarian, because I am not a librarian by profession, and they hired someone with community engagement skills. And that made all the difference. The library is now vibrant. We are about to do a $4 million renovation with a less than $300,000 budget, right? It's all possible if we're creative in what we do, and we leverage partnerships with key organizations and key funders. Funders are out there and they do want to give money, and they want to give money to change agents, and we are that. Every one of you in here has your own story and has that change agent mentality. That's why we're in this room. So I think listening and hearing to the community, especially the most vulnerable, now that it's been very clear to us with COVID who the most vulnerable are, that we do need to see them, and we do need to be inclusive, and we do need to be a we. It can't happen just with an I. So I really am grateful for this opportunity that I have been given to share a little bit of the work that Highwood is doing and the work that's yet to come. This is just the beginning for us to work in libraries and begin to change what libraries are really all about.
I think of it in terms of entrepreneurs, thinking like an entrepreneur, because in my situation, the lack of taxpayer funding, I had to look at things of, okay, an entrepreneur wants income, I need income, how do we make that happen? And so we were able to be creative and then work with the people. I would write subject lines to people, and it would be, subject line would be, what if, ... And then their answer would just be, hell yes. Whatever the crazy idea was, it was like, yes, let's do that. The other thing, this may be unpopular here, but I received my MLS 2 years ago, and I got it out of spite. It was I got it to prove that I did not need what with hindsight, I will say 50%, I think about 50% of the curriculum applied to my reality of what I do. So I would be a proponent of looking at what is taught by library educators to get more creative people into the field.
Well, if anybody disagrees with any of the comments, say they came from Kelvin Watson. So Terry's coming. I know we're close to time.
I'm going to lead us in. Believe it or not, you have 10 more minutes if you need
Okay.
it. But I'm going to give you the option of needing it. First, I'm going to explain what's going to come next, and then we'll go to break. After the break, Shaylyn's going to come back up and join us for a question and answer session of 30 minutes. So we would love for you all who are with us today to think of questions that can foster a good, deep discussion about the things we've heard from Robert Putnam and Shaylyn and our panelists on the dais right now. We have Post-it notes that you can either write your questions on, attribute them to yourself, or anonymize them, either way, or Calvin, and feed them to your note taker, your IMLS note taker with the host badge at your table, or feed them to me, and we will come back after the break and have a robust question and answer session. So with that, I will give you all the last word.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Is it possible, we're going to do Q&A for Shaylyn and me to respond, but I wonder whether we could, at least I would like to comment very briefly on what we've heard now from these panelists, because I think it was, to me, very instructive.
We would love that.
But I don't want to throw the whole organization off kilter. So
No.
what I'm afraid of is when we come back,
We're getting the yes
when we
from
come-
Crosby. We've got a yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So the
Shaylyn,
idea of Professor
I'm gonna-
Putnam thought I was crazy is great. That is all-star. Thank you, Professor.
Hold it, Felton. Hold it. First of all, Felton, you may or may not know that I grew up in a small town, a tiny town, about 70 miles west of Cleveland.
Yes.
Ages ago, so I can, right now, this is probably 70 years ago, I could name for you the starting lineup of the Cleveland Indians, well, what they were then called the Cleveland Indians, in 1952. So there, I want to identify with both the small town people in the audience, but also with Cleveland. And I apologize for calling them the Cleveland Indians. I'm that old that I don't even remember the new name of the Indians, of the Cleveland Ball Club.
Guardians.
I only wanted to make one point because it's relevant actually to what everybody here said. I really like Felton's question, which is, how can this group stop preaching to the choir? You all know all of these things. And the question is, I know actually that there's a very large number of librarians out there who ought to know what you know and ought to be doing what you're doing, but they've not yet got the message. And that seems to me the direction in which that moves me is to say there needs to be a social movement among librarians to kind of, I mean, of course, to social movement beyond libraries, but in particular among librarians, to mobilize many larger numbers of librarians. I'm a huge fan of libraries, as Crosby knows better than anybody. I'm an enormous fan of libraries, not just as a consumer, but as a analyst of society. But I do think that more thought is needed about that question that Felton asked. Not just what good things are you guys doing, but how can you reach out to mobilize a much larger number of librarians? And the last point I want to make has to do with the role that libraries played in the progressive era, because it was an extremely important role, and that is the Carnegie Libraries. And I don't know how widely, maybe the Carnegie Library story is very well known among contemporary librarians, among all of you. So maybe I'm just, again, preaching to the choir. You all know about Carnegie Libraries, but if you don't, there are deeply interesting parallels between the problem that the Carnegie Libraries, that Andrew Carnegie set out to create, and the problems that face America today. For example, Andrew Carnegie was himself a librarian. He was a librarian who made his fortune. He was a person who made his fortune because he came out of libraries. I don't mean library school. I mean because he was in libraries. That's what first of all awakened his intellect, and he gave back. Do you know that at least in 1930, or no, maybe more recently, that 1950s, half of all public libraries in America were founded as Carnegie Public Libraries. It was a huge, had an enormous impact on the reality of libraries in America. And so it was intimately tied with the immigration of that period, both he himself as an immigrant, and secondly, he was intending that libraries should serve the purpose that that Carmen was talking about in her town. And he was intending to reach out to rural areas. I mean, the resonance between what Andrew Carnegie was trying to do and did do was, first of all, to make libraries present in throughout America, but secondly, to make libraries community institutions of community learning, community centers. And that's, I think, a lot of what you're all doing. And so I'm not trying to say that you have to take instruction from Andrew Carnegie and the Carnegie Libraries, but I do think you'd find a lot of inspiration and some lessons in that. Why am I talking about it? Because it's the progressive era. It was libraries, and Carnegie played a crucial role in the upswing. Sorry to go on so long.
We appreciate your comments. I will give the panelists a last word. Yeah.
One last thing is we changed our library name to the Highwoods Library and Community Center, because that is exactly what we are now, is a community center that welcomes all people, that listens to the needs of the community, and we respond with relevant programming. So it's important for us to say that we have a community center within our library, because that's who we are.
Wonderful.
I jumped the gun, I'm sorry.
All good. I think Felton wants the microphone back.
No, but to the professor's point, I think there has to be...
Bob, please.
Okay, all right, I could say Bob. Look at that. Look at who I am today. All right, but it goes to the idea that I think most of us believe that we have moved from the traditional model to the transformational model in library world, and many of us are so far gone from the traditional model that we don't even think about it in that sense anymore. But I think if we really were to look across especially for us who are in public libraries, 9,000 public library systems, and we started to examine how many of them still operated in the traditional model, I think we'd find a lot more than we probably think, right? And so I think having that traditional model be there can be transformational for many communities. But what you see here, with us here, is that we have really been able to create much more transformation and connect our communities to their libraries in different ways by being transformational rather than traditional. And I think there needs to be much more discussion about that in library. I think we find ourselves in an echo chamber many times when we get together, and we've got to figure out how do we go out and do that work outside. And lastly, to your point, Bob, I think we do need to find a Carnegie, and it may not have to be someone who's spending boatloads of money on us, but we need, I think in libraries, someone to be a hype man out there for us in the general larger world. And I'm not sure who that's going to be, but I don't think it's Flavor Flav, but I think there should be somebody. We've got to figure out who that is, because in essence, what Andrew Carnegie did was make libraries seen as the most important part of their communities in a lot of ways. And we've we continue to do that, but I don't know if everyone sees it in that way. Beyonce would be great.
For a long time, I called myself an accidental librarian, and I guess I can't do that anymore because I'm so passionate about it. But I think all of us are at an incredible, once in a lifetime, once in 100 years time for libraries right now. I just think this is the time, and I hope we spend our money wisely and we don't let the opportunity pass us by.
Great.
What a great note to end on. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, keynote. All right, we've got our two keynoters and our three panelists here for our 30-minute question period. We did get some sticky notes to kick us off. If you have sticky notes that haven't made it up this way, there's some IMLS folks that are wandering. You can, bring them up to me on the podium. We also have 3 mics in the audience, so there's a possibility to just get up and stand and ask your question. The mics are on the floor. We're going to start with the sticky note questions, but we'll get to the mics. And we have many questions, so to the extent that our panelists and keynoters can be brief in the response to the questions, we'll get through more of them. So I think we're going to start with one that came in and is probably directed more to Bob and Shaylyn. The question is, if the 20th century wasn't truly radically inclusive, or racially inclusive, was it really that strong an upswing across the 4 metrics?
That's a good question. Good question.
Would you like me to repeat it, or you got it?
No, we got it.
Okay.
Shaylyn, you want to take it? Or either of us can take it, but you're the specialist.
Sure. So, okay, brevity being the key, I'm going to just give it a minute to think where to start and how to make this brief. Because I will just say, this is a fantastic question. It deserves much more time than we're about to give it. There is an entire chapter in the book that addresses the question of race and the movement over this period toward or away from racial equality and how that maps on to the I century. So if you're really curious about this, I would encourage you to just take a look at that, and you don't have to buy the book, you can check it out of your library. So what I'll say is this. I think that our question, we approach this question from a data standpoint because the whole backbone of the book is data, right? So the question is, what longitudinal data do we have that maps onto this same period that can help us answer this question? When you talk about what people assume the data looks like over this period, a lot of people assume that because things were in fact extraordinarily bleak from a racial equality and inclusion perspective at the beginning of the century, there's often this assumption that nothing changed for the better until the lightning bolt changes of the 1950s and 60s civil rights revolution. And what we would call, so the graphs that you saw look like sort of inverted U curves, right? By contrast, a lot of people feel like the movement toward racial equality and inclusion looks more like a hockey stick. No change and then dramatic change. That turns out to be true when you're looking at measures of inclusion, particularly things like the long delayed entry of Black Americans into professional schools and professions, lack of representation in government, residential segregation, on and on and on. There are many measures where it was just purely exclusionary, and it took that sort of changing of the de jure segregation for things to begin to move. Interestingly, and what came as a surprise to us, is that the curve does not look that way when you're asking questions about material equality between the races. And when I say between the races, I mean between Black Americans and white Americans, and the only reason that we are framing it in that way is because that's what we have data for over this long period. It's not because other peoples of color don't matter, it's because we don't have data over the full period to answer that question with other groups, but we do for Black Americans and white Americans. And what's so interesting is that when you look at the data, and when we're talking about material equality, we're talking about things like health measures, so infant mortality and life expectancy. We're talking about income distribution. We're talking about wealth or home ownership, for example. We're also talking about voter registration and voter participation. When you roll all of those measures together and you ask yourself, were we moving more toward equality? Was the racial gap narrowing or widening over this 20th century period, and when and how fast? What you actually see is that the bulk of progress toward narrowing the gap took place during the upswing, actually before the Civil Rights Revolution, which I think, particularly for white Americans, that's a surprising story. It's not that surprising, I think, for a lot of Black Americans, because this is their genealogy, this is their family history, this is the Great Migration. The main driver of that move toward equality was because Black Americans stood up and claimed their place in the American we and left the South for the more hospitable west and north in this country. And so you see that very clearly in the data. And we often get the question, well, you know, there was just so much room for improvement for Black Americans, maybe that's the whole explanation, but it actually turns out that everyone in America was doing better and better over that first 2/3 of the 20th century, but Black Americans were doing actually better at a much faster rate than white Americans, which is really interesting, right? But then comes the other surprise. Right when the dam of exclusion breaks and the civil rights laws are passed, you see very clearly in the data what we call in the book a foot off the gas period. So you had all this progress on material equality that then stagnates, stalls, and in some cases reverses during the I period in American history. So we have this view, when I say we, I'm referring mostly to white Americans. We have this view that like the civil rights movement happened, we fixed that. Things have gotten better and better, right? And I think one of the most important messages of the Black Lives Matter movement has been to shed light on the fact that that's a completely false narrative. The data is very clear that things have stagnated or gotten worse for Black Americans in this country. And when you look at that over the full course of what we're looking at here of this I period, you have to ask yourself, well, how does this map on to the I story? Well, it turns out that the time when America was moving more and more in the direction of we turned out to have been better for Black Americans than a time when culturally more broadly we turned toward hyper-individualism. Hyper-individualism is bad for everyone. It's particularly bad for traditionally excluded groups. And that bears out very clearly in the data. And so it's a complicated story because we're not saying, wow, this first 2/3 of the 20th century, we should model everything on that because it was so great. But what we are saying is, again, if we're getting underneath these questions, there is some cultural work that we need to do around restoring this culture of we, the belief that we are all in this together, the feeling that we are all in this together. That work has to be done because that actually is an incredibly important part of this story, not just policies that are going to equalize things or make things less segregated. We have to do that heart work to get back into the cultural and moral ethos of we. I think that's a really important lesson here. It's not an easy thing of saying first 2/3 of the 20th century, good or bad, should model on that, shouldn't. I mean, it's obviously much more complex than that. And so hopefully that gives you a little bit of a taste of our thinking on this and how the data lines up here.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We're going to turn to a question for our library panelists. Can you talk about how your library has activated local networks of support and social cohesion in your communities? Maybe an example or two. So how have you activated local networks of support and social cohesion in your community?
Can I go first? Sure. So our air conditioning went out last year. And we just put out a call to the community. We don't have money to fix it, and we can't open until we get the money. And within 4 days, we had $18,000 to replace it. I got a $10,000 check somebody handed me, and they said, "We trust you to do something important for the community with this." No direction, no strings attached, $10,000. And so we started a library of things to check out. Pressure washer and carpet cleaner are most popular, but bicycles and canning supplies and all kinds of things. We have an annual luncheon, Friends of the Library luncheon every year, and I just talked about, and briefly, because they don't want to hear me talk, I talked briefly to We Feed Kids snacks after school. And the next week I got a check in the mail from someone I didn't know, and I opened it up, and it was for $17,500, and it said, "Keep feeding kids." And honestly, my brain could not make sense of the amount. I kept thinking, is this $17.50? Because that seems so odd. But because we have done what matters to the community, we're doing an Aging in Place initiative right now, the community has really responded. And I do think now if the library was to close, there would be pitchforks. I mean, people really support us now.
Awesome example of social cohesion and support.
I would also say that for us at Highwood, when I said earlier that we were able to serve 23,000 meals, we didn't use tax levy dollars. During COVID, we partnered with 2 other nonprofits. The other 2 nonprofits received grant funding, and we became just a distribution site, and we became the trusted entity. So we had lines of individuals, and when you see the stark poverty within this extremely wealthy community, it's very heartbreaking that I would see families take our recycled dumpster and use that as a transport, because families also do not have transportation in our community. So for us to have become a lifeline and have partnered with other entities to make that a possibility is incredible. The other piece is the recent grant that we received yesterday, as a matter of fact, a $578,000 grant to partner with one of the largest health systems in the community to do the access to health services in the area of mental health. That is a very important partnership because we know the stigma behind mental health, especially for communities of color and especially for an undocumented population. So partnering is very important. We can't do it alone. And so there is where the we comes in. And I can go on and on about the different partnerships. We had to raise $4 million to renovate a very outdated facility. It used to be 3 restaurants in the past. And so that became a library in 1976. And so it had not been renovated since 1976, and we still had the same furniture. So imagine that, nails sticking out and holes in the furniture. How is that an acceptable space for learning for a population like we serve? So it's miraculous to be able to raise almost the $4 million during COVID. But people care when they see that there is organizations that are trustworthy and that are willing to go above and beyond for their community. So just a little tidbit more.
And you know, very similar, whether it is working with our food banks, working with our hospitals, you know, giving out COVID tests or being a site for COVID testing, or like working with our legal aid societies so people can come in and get assistance and not be evicted, or you know, working with our school district to hand out thousands of PCs to their parents so that the kids can actually be able to get online. There were just so many different partners that we were working with during this period of time. But the great thing was that came out of it in this last year, we are having a big runoff for our new mayor. And one of the candidates stood up and said, as his first line, he says, the way we're going to get out of this is that we were going to make the library, our public library, the front door to democracy. And he won. Yes. So we're looking at how we put government innovation labs in all our buildings, right? So those are kind of examples.
Awesome. All right, I'm going to ask one more question from the stickies, and then we're going to go to the mic. So if anybody's ready, you can make your way up. This one's more for Bob. How can you measure the impact libraries have on local networks of support and social inclusion?
Well, I'm trying to figure out a way to not answer in a too academic a way. I mean, there are lots of ways, in fact, to measure. There are lots of serious ways in which you could evaluate your initiatives, especially by doing before and after. That is, measuring something like youth well-being or like political participation. Well, a range of things you could measure before and after you've tried some initiative, and that would tell you, did we actually move the needle? I'm a little torn here because I want to emphasize what I think you could do beyond libraries and beyond providing social services, which you are doing, and it's wonderful. I know I'm not being negative about that at all. How could you positively affect politics in America? And that's, I know, seems like a stretch. I recognize that seems like a stretch. So let me ask, I mean, I will tell you how I think you could do it, but I'm asking you now to challenge yourself. Don't think of yourselves as victims of polarization. Think of yourselves as agents that maybe could work against polarization. And that means building, in my jargon, which Felton referred to earlier, bridging social capital. That is politically bridging social capital. That is bringing people together to discuss local community problems across party lines. That's not easy. That's a big challenge. And I think I just mentioned, or one of us mentioned earlier on in the, maybe that was in another session today. Not long ago, Shaylyn and I were speaking to a group in Kansas City, actually, of a local group in Kansas City that is devoting its, not a library, but they no doubt are cooperating with the Kansas City Library, bringing people from very different backgrounds together to discuss urgent, practical local community problems like schools. Everybody's talking about schools, right? And fighting about schools. That's one of the biggest flashpoints in American society today. But we're shouting at each other about that. And so the challenge, there are many other examples besides schools, but the challenge I'm suggesting is, could you bring people from different points of view in Greater Cleveland? I'm using that example because I know it much better. You know, people from Cuyahoga Heights and people from, down toward Youngstown and Akron, and people from, the inner city and so on, together to talk about schools and how they could be fixed, intentionally bringing people from different backgrounds and different political backgrounds, especially different political backgrounds. And then, of course, the question was asked me was, could you measure that? Absolutely, I can tell you ways in which you can measure that, but I'm trying to put that as a challenge to you all, and not just to the panelists here, but to the room as a whole.
Thank you.
And can I just add one thing there, which is that you don't have to do that programming yourself. I mean, there's a whole dialogue across difference movement happening in America. There's probably 3 different organizations nearby every one of your libraries that's figured out the facilitation model and figured out, how to do this well. You could just invite them into your space, right? This doesn't have to be another thing that you have to create from scratch.
Mm-hmm. So helpful.
Why don't you name a couple, Shaylyn?
Braver Angels is the number one that I would recommend for political discussion specifically, but there's just so many and a lot of them are really regional and really local. So, but Braver Angels is national. They're a chapter-based organization, so they're entirely citizen-run. I would say start there.
Thank you. Just as a time check, we're already halfway through our Q&A, so we're clearly not going to get to all the stickies, but I will commit to putting them on a parking lot so that they can be, rumbled with in our personal time. And we have a question from the floor.
I had a sort of follow-up to this conversation on the role libraries can play in sort of active civic discourse. Part of what I pulled from the data that you put out there is that how divided we are is in part what gets in our way of being able to have civil conversations. And I know that we in libraries, many libraries that I've worked in, we've tried various different versions of this, some successful and some less successful. And one of the things I'm curious about is how do you get people back to a point where they actually can trust one another. And is the first entry point conversations around, gun violence in my neighborhood, or like, is that the right place, or is there a before point in terms of how we build back some of the social cohesion, and how do we tie that back to? So I'm just curious, like, I think in the public library space, we generally think of ourselves as being able to do this kind of stuff well, and yet we continue to struggle to do it well. And so I'm curious if there's an earlier step that we can actually give ourselves credit for building those connections before we jump, right into some of the really hairy issues.
I have two quick responses, and I think probably Shaylyn has more. One, don't always think of failed experiments as a failure. Entrepreneurs, if they never had a losing, if they never had an idea that they funded that didn't go well, they would think they're not being risky. They were not taking enough risks. And you have to, this is what the laboratory of democracy meant. You try out ideas. So you shouldn't be discouraged if you try out an idea and it didn't work. Try something else. Trying, it's that experimental attitude that the progressives above all had. Secondly, my view is that you ought to look first for topics that are not political, but that people care about, but that that cut across party lines. And my best example, I use it a lot, but Felton will think I'm just picking on or just using Cleveland. I bet there are a lot of people in Cleveland who care about the Cleveland sports teams.
Oh yeah.
Maybe, huh?
You don't have to worry about that.
Across party lines. And they probably have divergent views about, who should be quarterback next year, or I don't even have to go through all those issues. And hosting a session like that, it seems a little weird, I recognize, and maybe it's not the right example, but what I'm trying to say is finding topics that lots of people care about in which their differences do not correlate with their politics. That kind of discussion is what builds a little bit of trust, because they, after you finish the conversation, people are then feeling a little more positive about the guy who turns out to be Trump's supporter or whatever, but that was not the most important fact, the most salient fact in the conversation. I don't know if that makes sense. It makes sense or not, Felton.
No, it does. I did want to ask, though, if I could, Shaylyn and you, has there been any research to determine if the younger you are, the more flexible you are, more likely you are to be open to other discussion as compared to folks maybe over 25?
That's a Bob question for sure. I mean, I can give a vague answer, but you can be much more specific, Bob. And then I do want to add a couple thoughts.
Yes.
Oh, well, I could have said that. Yeah, I mean, I would just say to the previous question, Braver Angels, for example, and there are many, they have been honing a facilitation model to be able to create safe space to talk about hot button issues. They've been working on that since 2016 or earlier. And so that's why inviting these organizations in that have the tools and templates built, they've already made all the mistakes you can make, and they've figured out how to facilitate those conversations in a positive way. So that's one reason to look to that expertise. But the other thing I would say is, the more you are building community around affinity meaning we all like basket weaving, and so we come to the library to learn basket weaving, and then I discover that the person I'm across the table with weaving a basket is a Democrat and I'm a Republican, that is incredibly important work. You cannot understate the value of that work. Actually, I think that's probably more important than these staged conversations where we get in a room and debate our hot button issues. So I'm going to hop back to advocating for the hot button issue debates, though, which is that you have to keep in mind that if you are structuring debates well, you're building citizenship skills. So the goal is not always to get people to come to the end of an hour and agree, or think, oh, all of a sudden I think well of my Republican neighbors, or vice versa, but you think of it as citizen skill building for having better debates, right? Learning how to debate is a democratic skill.
And who's the quarterback of the Cleveland Browns is a hot button topic.
Interesting. So debate that, and then you're
Debate.
building skills that then you can transfer to harder topics later on.
All right. As a time check, I've gotten permission to let this go a little longer, so we're going to have 15 more minutes of Q&A, and we'll make a little bit of a shorter activity. So I'd love to have another question from the floor.
Hi, my name is Nicole Cook. I'm the Augusta Baker Endowed Chair for Childhood Literacy at the University of South Carolina. And I have a question for the panelists. So I just wanted to give a little context. There was a comment made about LIS education. I hear the laughter already. So it's really not as simple as saying, oh, the library school should teach X, Y, and Z. And before I make my next comment, I have personally told Tracy Hall at ALA all of these things. Love Tracy, happy to support her, and she's on board. But we are very much constrained by accreditation. We are constrained by the PhD pipeline. I personally have been in 2 programs where I have innovated the curriculum for equity, diversity, inclusion, and social justice. I am the only one teaching these classes in my programs, right? So who's coming to help me teach these classes? And more importantly, these classes are electives, right? So, I think that part of what's happening is the classic conflict between theory and practice. But I will say that our programs are absolutely putting out the upstanders, the uprisers, the bystanders, whatever we want to call them. They may be geographically constrained. We certainly need more of these students, but they're there. And so, there's lots of debate we can have about this, but I needed to push back a little bit on that. I have at least 6 of my LIS faculty colleagues in the audience here today, and we are dancing as fast as we can. So with that said, several of you in the room have guest lectured for me, and I have my eye on quite a few more. So if you would like to guest lecture and talk to the children directly, I am happy to have you. But just to say, we don't do the mechanics of literacy, right? We leave that to our wonderful K-12 educators. But we are talking about the practice of reading and what it means and how to have these conversations. I think a lot of you would be really surprised at the things that we're talking about. So if we can, add to the lengthy list of what we're doing here in the 2 days and find a way to better partner up with the LIS programs, I think we can absolutely contribute to that progress. Thank you.
I just wanted to comment what Brian was saying about facilitating these conversations, these difficult conversations. And I reach out to our Office of Human Rights, and they have been an extraordinary partner in diversity dialogues. We have ongoing dialogues. They, like you said, are skilled at this. So even when I had a staff discussion, I don't have the lived experience of my staff. I live in a majority minority community in Prince George's County, Maryland. And so I had the director of the Office of Human Rights lead this conversation for me because I felt it was important that my staff were able to voice their opinions, but not from someone who looks like me, because I don't have that experience. So there's a lot of groups out there that can help you facilitate so you don't have to feel like you're on your own island, which of course we all do sometimes. So I just wanted to make that comment. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Hi, folks. I'm Rich Raisgal. I'm the director here at the DC Public Library. Anne Friedman, who welcomed us to this building that she started, she mentioned a 2004 study that the NEA put out called Reading at Risk. And that was the study that documented the decline in reading and also sort of attached it to the corollaries and other declines in civic participation, voting, going to sporting events, volunteering, and all these other social ills that we're talking about today. And while you're all talking about the great things that so many of us are doing in terms of providing COVID tests and all these other great things. I'm just wondering fundamentally, are any of us figuring out a way to tie all these great programs back to some of the core stuff that we're to be doing, right? How do we leverage giving out a PCR test to getting somebody interested in reading a book? Because I think part of what, and I won't speak for Crosby, but I think part of what he wants to do here is how do we how do we take all these great things and get people back to reading? Open question if anybody has any ideas.
Well, I can say for us that we are not a quiet library. We're a no shushing library. We do a lot of things that are fun, drones, STEM nights, all those kind of things. So now we really are a hangout for kids. It used to be a place that children weren't welcome. So at least we are getting them in the building and exposing them.
Yeah, I'll say to that, I think one of the keys to what we want to do in getting people in the building is for them to recognize the traditional model of what we do, right? And the importance of reading for them to be successful. But a lot of that comes along with having it co-signed by others. One of the part of our new mayor talking about us being the front door to democracy was the first thing he said is, I want to do a citywide campaign on literacy, right? And I want the library to lead this campaign. That all kind of started because he came into the library before he became mayor to get a COVID test, right? Right. This is not part of many other things that he used the library for, and he did. He did the swearing in of the honorary swearing in at the library that he went to as a kid, right? So the idea that we have to take advantage of these folks in our communities who are tied to the library for a variety of different reasons, and then use their bully pulpit to keep talking about that. I mean, that's our job, to get out there and talk about reading and the importance of reading, but we need a lot of people talking about it, right? And, Beyonce talking about it would be great, right? I believe I have two daughters who would do whatever Beyonce says, right? But I think we need as many Pied Pipers as possible talking about it. And I appreciate the idea at my table when we first introduced ourselves. I said, I appreciate the idea that I have to try to move away from my concept of really being focused on social justice back to where I started in libraries, right? And find a way to integrate them together.
And I'll make a comment and say that in communities like mine, where I come from, where I grew up as a child, there were no libraries. I'm an immigrant. I came to this country undocumented. There were no libraries. And so for my job in my community is to really help broaden that mindset of the community that this is a library. It is not a libreria, and a libreria means a bookstore. So for changing the culture and the mindset of what this institution is very important. Once we get them in the door, we gain their trust, then we connect them to the book and we connect them to the literacy programming. All the programming that we create at our library is outcome-based programming. So we are measuring the success of the reading levels for children. We partner directly with the school district and support the school district in the extended learning process. So it's changing the culture for a community like ours. And so, like I said earlier, ours is 50% Latino, which presume that our library is a bookstore. And so teaching that and helping them understand that, no, we are a free institution where you could access these resources and learn how to read. And so
I think we have time for one more question.
May I ask one? Sorry.
Yes, absolutely.
Could I ask one quick question? I'm so old that when I was learning to read, I went with my mom every Saturday to a reading group at the library. And in those years, that's very old-fashioned. I know the family structure was different and so on. But is an updated version of that also now common? Are reading groups for kids common in libraries? Because I think that's a brilliant.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm just responding to the question that had been asked earlier.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Story time is the foundation of what we do.
Yes. Yeah.
Great.
Am I on?
You are.
Hi, I'm Lisa. And I run a large public library system. And, you know, I think we're in a really interesting period because we know technology saved us during the early part of COVID, right? All of us who run public libraries say, libraries open, technology, technology. We put out hotspots. We boosted signals. We had people, we lent out hotspots. We lent out laptops. The problem is, I think we're moving back to transaction, Felton. It's not just the lending out of the thing. It is what they're doing with the thing. And I think this is the opportunity, Crosby, because, and the citizenship part, and I know UW is doing some fabulous work. By the way, I need more money from UW to do that work. But I think what we need to do is be, Carnegie was about improving, and we can all disagree what improvement meant in 19th century versus now, but he was about bettering the community, bettering oneself. And I think we have the opportunity now with technology, if we're good and careful, to get away from the transaction part and how are we bettering our communities? How are we helping them navigate the technology that we are now providing, the broadband, the stuff out, all the stuff our rural communities need, and by the way, our suburban communities need too. So that's just the question I have of all of you and all of us to be thoughtful when we jump on the technology bandwagon, and I love technology, that we're doing it in the way public libraries do it the best, which is to help the people be the better of themselves that they want to be them their own better selves, whatever that looks like. Make sense? Mm-hmm. Thank you.
All right. I want to give each of our speakers one last closing thought, maybe 30 seconds or a minute each, responding to questions or just if you have something on your heart you want to say. Anybody want to start?
Can I just respond quickly to that and maybe make this my closing thought? I mean, I see enormous opportunity for libraries to be stepping into the space of training citizens for how to navigate the information that is coming at them, which I think is a little bit what you're getting at, right? And I think this is the #1 arena in which we need civic innovation. How are we going to manage the fact that we have a citizenry that doesn't know truth from falsehood? How do we train? Because it used to be, you know, you could just check out a book, right? And yes, there were some debate about what books were good and what were bad, but like now we're not in that space anymore. That's obvious. You don't need me to expound on that. But I think that this is going back to the root of what libraries originally were. It's about information, and that is one of the most hotly contested spaces now in our democracy that may be the do or die for our democracy, information. And so I would just challenge you, not to put one more thing on your enormous plates, but what is the action there that is directly tied to citizenship about navigating a very difficult information space, much of which is online?
And I would say thank you for being patient with my story, our story here, and being willing to hear this story. What I will share is what drives me daily is to be relevant to our community, all of our community, all the taxpayers, not just a certain segment of the population that speaks of their needs. I want to work towards that in our library. I am going to continue to enhance the programming that takes place out of the community center and transform a community to make them more productive members of society through the work that we're doing in our library. So it's exciting to be a part of something like this, and it's exciting to be a leading force, at least in my neck of the woods, to do something like this. I have been approached by several libraries in my community who would like to learn more of how to do this. And I'm excited to be a part of that teaching and that connectedness, because we're all together in this, like you shared earlier. We're in this together. We're all one people. And so it's exciting to be a part of such such a thing where we could help transform all members of the community.
And I'll just speak to the technology through an example. We are starting a program that we're hiring 15 teenagers to be digital navigators specifically for older adults. And we're starting that in partnership with the Health Science Center is coming, and they're bringing a simulation lab. For the teens, the first training session will be to learn how it is to work with computers if you have low vision or hearing issues or mobility issues. And so through this program, we will be teaching, the teens will be learning some soft skills. They'll be learning job skills. I've been reading about the longevity economy. Our rural area needs people to be able to age in place. I hope some of those teens see entrepreneurial opportunities as they go through this program. Through ECF, those seniors will be getting specific devices that they can keep. So it just, to me, it all comes together. All these things work together for social well-being for our communities.
And I will just say, and this is a point that you're making there, Shaylyn. Success moves at the speed of trust, right? And we are very fortunate that as an industry and as a profession, we are very trusted, right? And we can use that trust to really make a difference in our communities. But I think and I was just saying this, I think we have to really start to focus on our youngest people because they have been through a trauma that no one else can ever experienced. Just imagine all of our 10-year-olds, 8-year-olds who haven't been to school, who have gone through and seen losses in their life. They are willing to and ready to make a change in the way this world is, and we've got to be willing to help them do that.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. Robert Putnam?
I'd like to build a little bit on what Felton just said. Libraries have many different age constituencies. Very young kids, young adults, older adults, even really old adults like me. But from the point of view of building a social movement that is going to change America, I'm going back to the story we told and that Shaylyn told. It was young Americans in their late teens and 20s the last time who let us out. There are some good examples of that now. That is, there are some terrific examples of kids of that age group that are helping to lead a civic renewal in America. But inevitably, they're a minority. Most kids of that age are not leading civic renewal activities. They've got other things on their mind. It's my grandchildren. I know that age group very well. But I think libraries ought to be thinking about that constituency too, not just the people who are learning to read, not just the people like me who, need to be brought into libraries to keep us from being lonely. But this is really a point that Felton made earlier, and I'm just reiterating it. Not just the what you do for young kids, but inviting young people in their late teens and 20s into libraries to be agents, not just to receive stuff from you, but to be agents to help you become active contributor to revitalizing American democracy.
Well, on that note, can we all thank our panelists and speakers?